I think I cannot hide my disappointment that we are not all in Brussels right now and doing this conference in person, but still we are trying to do as good as it gets in an online format. Today we are starting with a panel where we will dive deep into the dynamics of differentiated integration and try to understand what different political actors think when it comes to the big concept of differentiated integration. So we have four great speakers who will talk us through the government perspective, the political parties perspective, the citizens perspective when it comes to differentiated integration. And then we have a veteran politician who will give us a more broader view on all these perspectives and introduce also the European Parliament's perspective, taking a closer look to this very important institution. First, before I introduce the speakers, first we have a couple of remarks to make for the Twitter geeks. We have the hashtag InDivEU to use throughout the panels, so feel free to tweet. And while doing so, it will be very much appreciated if you could also tag TEPSA. Secondly, all this project has been funded by the European Commission's, European Union's Age 2020 research funding. So I would like to also express once again in the name of the entire consortium that we are very grateful for the funding. We at Elcano Royal Institute also organized a Spanish Stakeholders Forum. So I was personally participating in a national stakeholder forum as well, which was a very interesting experience. So without further ado, I would like to introduce shortly our panelists today, and then I will ask each of them one by one 3 questions. So we have more of a conversational setting here. So Stefan Telle from European University Institute, who is a research associate at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies. And as far as I know, he has been one of the core researchers of this consortium and this group. Secondly, we have, and from Stefan, we will hear about government's perspective when it comes to differentiated integration. Good morning, Stefan. Then secondly, we have Marta Lorimer from London School of Economics, and she has been a postdoctoral research associate in the same project, and she has a special interest on the normative foundations of differentiated integration in the European Union. And we will hear more about political parties' perspectives from Marta. Good morning, Marta. Thirdly, we have Catherine de Vries from Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and Bocconi, University of Bocconi, where she is a Dean of Diversity and Inclusion. That's a cool title, eh, Catherine? And Professor of Political Science. I'm sure you all know her from her books and from her extensive research on public opinion, elections, and political parties. And I think she also counts as 1/4 Spanish, so we have that connection there as well. Good morning, Catherine. Good to see you.
Good morning. Buenas.
And last but not least, we have Richard Corbett from the European Parliament, as I already said, a veteran politician who has been a member of the European Parliament from 1996 to 2009, and again back in the House 2014 to 2020. And during that period, he was the coordinator for the Socialists and Democrats group on constitutional questions. So if you have questions on the Constitutional Treaty, Lisbon Treaty, and differentiated integration, we have the right man sitting with us today in this panel. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning.
So as I have already said, I will ask 3 questions each to our panelists. I will start with Stefan, and I would like to kindly ask that you don't take more than 5 minutes to answer each question. And as I said, we have more conversational kind of dialogue here this morning. And in the meantime, please feel free to comment on the chat as the speakers speak, or ask questions as the speakers speak. And I will do my best in introducing your remarks also in the panel. Jim did a great job yesterday on commenting on speakers, so I hope at least him will be as included in the panel as yesterday. So, Stefan, let's start with the preferences of governments. My first question to you is that what is the salience of differentiated integration in governmental discourses, mainly if the governments, the member state governments, talk about differentiated integration, and on which occasions according to your research?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Ilke. Good morning, panelists, and good morning to the audience. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk a little bit about the research we did in the interview project. And given the considerable research interest in differentiated integration in recent years, you might think that DI is an issue of some importance to national governments. However, until recently, we did not know much about this question because the issue of salience has not been at the center of research on differentiated integration. And I think that one explanation for this omission is that researchers have understood differentiation as a tool which politicians use in specific situations to overcome gridlock in the European Union. And in this instrumental perspective, DI was not necessarily seen as something that governments would have a lot, would talk about a lot, unless they really had to talk about it. So we can ask, in which situations would they have to talk about differentiated integration? And in its function as a veto buster, DI is particularly relevant in moments of treaty change, enlargement, or major crisis which require a rapid response, rapid common response by the European Union. And therefore, we would expect that debates about differentiation also cluster around such moments. And in addition, that they would have a rather pragmatic, policy-oriented and ad hoc character, rather than a strategic nature, taking into account the long-term consequences of DI on the European Union. So having this in mind, we assembled a team of more than 30 researchers to study government programs and key speeches by heads of state and government in 27 member states between 2004 and 2019. And what we found is that while European affairs commonly featured in these documents, sometimes quite prominently, DI hardly played a role there. What we found instead is that what we found often instead is pledges to be a reliable partner in a united union. So then we looked at parliamentary minutes to see whether DI is perhaps a more prominent feature of day-to-day politics. And as a measure for the salience of DI here, we used the frequency of certain keywords such as two-speed Europe, core Europe, variable geometry, or a la carte Europe. And the assumption here was, of course, that the more politicians talk about something, the more important it is to them. And our main insight, I would say, from this exercise is that DI was not a salient issue in most national parliaments for most of the time. And while we found that debates about DI were somewhat more pronounced in certain member states, such as Ireland, France, the Netherlands, but also Slovakia and the Czech Republic, the differences between member states were small, and we saw no obvious geographic patterns there. But what we did find is that attention to DI was indeed focused in years around treaty change, enlargements, and the Euro crisis, and especially in 2017, the year when the Commission released its white paper on the future of Europe. And arguably, this white paper was perhaps one of the first times that DI was really cast as a strategic choice in contrast to uniform integration as a scenario for the future of Europe. But as I said, the initiative came from the European Commission and not from the member states. And sure enough, the white paper did not lead to a more sustained interest in DI in national parliaments, as attention quickly dropped back again in the following years. So to conclude, overall, I think that these findings lend support to the notion that DI is indeed mainly seen as a tool for overcoming gridlock in the European Union, and which national politicians start to consider mainly when they run out of alternatives. Thank you.
Actually, you already mentioned some of the differences between the positions of different member states. Actually, can you go a bit deeper on that part? What kind of geographical cleavages that we can see? What are the differences between the North and the South and the East, the newcomers, the old members? What can you tell us a bit more on the geographical differences inside the European Union?
Yes, thank you. This is a great question. But so when we tried to establish government attitudes towards differentiated integration, we encountered two main difficulties, I would say. The first difficulty was, as I just mentioned, the low salience of DI in governmental documents and parliamentary records. And to be sure, governments do have policy-specific integration preferences, but how they think about abstract concepts such as two-speed Europe or core Europe was more difficult to establish. And in fact, we found so few references to DI that we were unable to distinguish positions of individual governments, and instead had to aggregate references for the entire period of investigation. And while this is obviously quite problematic, we found that changes in governments only rarely changed how DI was debated in a member state. The second difficulty we encountered was that there are many different forms of differentiated integration. Differentiation can happen via opt-outs, enhanced cooperation, intergovernmental agreements, or external agreements, and it can involve a core Europe surrounded by a less integrated periphery, or it may denote a variable geometry of policy regimes with diverse membership. In our approach, however, we assumed that the most fundamental question is whether differentiation is a temporary or a permanent feature of the European Union. So this corresponds to the distinction between a multi-speed Europe and a multi-destination Europe, which was made yesterday by Enrico Letta. In a multi-speed Europe, does not challenge the aspiration of an ever closer union, but it can rather be seen as a way to allow some member states to do more while others need more time to get ready. A multi-destination Europe, by contrast, questions the idea of an ever closer union and arguably increases the risk of fragmentation due to persistently high transaction costs and a long-term potential for politicians to exploit status differences between the member states for electoral gain. So looking at those two alternatives, what we found is that temporary and permanent differentiation are assessed differently in many, but not in all member states. And I want to highlight two examples. So in Germany, the idea of differentiated integration was seen quite negatively by German governments, as they have traditionally pursued a more inclusive approach to integration. By contrast, successive French governments have viewed the permanent differentiation or multi-destiny Europe as a potential means to move integration towards a more ambitious core. And while this core would in principle be open to latecomers, this was kind of secondary importance to many, often when French governments talked about differentiation, while the priority was on deepening rather than inclusiveness. And more generally, we found that neither of the two alternatives, multi-speed, multi-destination Europe, is favored by a clear majority of the member states, but instead that on average, both are seen slightly negatively, suggesting that differentiation is really seen as a second best solution when compared to either uniform integration or the status quo. And overall, we did not really find that positions on DI corresponded to geographic divides so much. But what we did find when we looked at factors which may explain differentiation, that these seem to play out differently in old and new member states sometimes. Thank you.
One last question on the point where you have left, actually. What factors explain the positions of the member state governments? Actually, you already alluded to the differences, for example, between Germany and France, and how they perceive the future of integration also give us hints about how they perceive differentiated integration in general. But if you could deep dive a bit more, what kind, according to your research, what kind of factors explain different positions of member states? Thank you.
Yes, sure. We started, of course, from the literature on differentiated integration, and the first factor that we looked at, which may impact how member states think about differentiated integration, was whether or not they have opt-outs themselves. And we assumed that the eye would perhaps be seen more positively in member states which have voluntary opt-outs from major EU policies, such as Schengen and the Eurozone specifically, and that it would be seen more negatively in countries which have involuntary opt-outs, which are excluded from these policies, but which would like to join. But surprisingly, what we found is in member states which have voluntarily opted out of one or both of these policies, differentiation was not necessarily seen more positively. And the reason for this seems to be that opting out comes at a cost of reduced influence in the European Union. And specifically in these member states, we found that parliamentary debates often revolved around the question of how to square the opt-out with the ambition to remaining at the core of Europe and not to become a second class, or not to move to the second tier of membership. And I think this chimes quite nicely with the findings of Marta Migliorati and Markus Jachtenfuchs and Philipp Gensche, who have told us yesterday that their research shows that political elites often seek post-opt-out reintegration for functional reasons in countries where opt-outs were voluntary, a voluntary choice of the member state. And with regard to involuntary opt-outs, what we found is that assessments of DI tend to be negative while these opt-outs persist and while these member states are excluded, but they improve when the opt-outs come to an end, as there then is a sense of this member state joining the core of Europe. However, where involuntary opt-outs persist for unusually long periods of time, such as in Romania and Bulgaria, for example, with regard to Schengen mainly, but also the Eurozone, assessments of both models of differentiated integration are quite negative. And here the perception is that differentiation persists due to political considerations in other member states and not due to actual capacity deficits in the excluded countries. And while only 2 countries are really affected from such unusually long involuntary opt-outs from major EU policies, the examples, I think, show that ambiguity about the justifications of differentiated integration can lead to perceptions of arbitrariness and feed narratives of second-class membership. And I think relatedly here, it is also interesting to think about several countries which do have a treaty obligation to join the Eurozone, but avail themselves of de facto opt-outs. And I'm thinking of Poland, the Czech Republic, Sweden, and Hungary mainly. And these countries too, they use technical arguments to justify what I guess is rather a political choice for non-cooperation in the Eurozone. And I think there's a risk here that such ambiguities can decrease the perceived fairness of differentiation. And this is something which I guess could easily get exploited by Eurosceptic political actors. And I'm not sure if I'm talking too long, but we also looked at a couple of other factors which I could briefly talk about, or maybe keep it for later.
Why don't we leave that for later, Stefan? Because what you have said the arbitrariness, ambiguity, and the perception of if the differentiated integration is fair and democratic connects us super well to Marta Lorimer, actually, because this is one of the key questions they ask in the beginning of the co-authored paper. And what we will ask more to Marta is that how political parties perceive. Actually, there's a very important connection between the governments and political parties, but I also very much care about this core question, no? Like, when is differentiated integration fair and democratic? So, Marta, why don't you start answering, first of all, how party actors view this? Like, do party actors view differentiated integration as a fair stream of cooperation in the EU? And are certain forms of differentiated integration believed to unsettle the equality of member states in the decision making? So why don't you dive into this fairness and arbitrariness and democratic character of differentiated integration a bit more? Take it out where Stefan left. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see you all here. It's a pity that it's not in Brussels in person, but I suppose there are advantages to not having to be outdoors these days. So in terms of what we find about whether political party actors see DI as a fair scheme of cooperation, I mean, I would say that the answer is usual. It's a yes and no. So in our research, we first considered what fair DI would look like from a normative perspective. And then we tried to look at to what extent political party actors viewed it as such. So to do this, we interviewed 35 MPs, MEPs, and political advisors in 7 EU member states. So these were Austria, Denmark, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Portugal, and Romania. And what we found was that they were rather divided on the fairness of differentiated integration. So we distinguished between their views on the substantive fairness of DI and on its procedural fairness. So substantive fairness essentially concerns redistributive social justice and what each individual owes and is due as a member of a system of social cooperation. So this was really about looking at what do different member states think that a fair contribution to the project is. And we found that while many political party actors accepted that DI could ensure a more equitable distribution of the costs and benefits of European integration, for example, when joining a policy would be exceedingly costly for certain member states, many also worried about some member states using DI to free ride and avoid paying their fair share in common projects. In terms of procedural fairness, which really focused on fair participation within and the legitimate exercise of power by political institutions of the EU, we also found some fairly mixed views, in a sense that while some party actors thought that DI could really potentially enhance democracy because it responds to the diverse views and capacities of member states. However, others were also quite adamant that there should be some constraints to ensure that differentiated integration does not result in domination. So here, for example, many rejected the idea of arbitrary exclusion of member states from differentiated policies. They really wanted these to remain open to all, for all to join and based on clear criteria. So I think this really resonates with something that Stefan was talking about in the case of Romania. So when we interviewed Romanian politicians, they felt very strongly that their exclusion from Schengen at this point was it was basically a political decision where what was a fair process was not respected. So a final concern that came up and that I think was touched upon yesterday was that there was a risk that differentiated integration could end up facilitating democratic backsliding. But it's also true that a large majority of our respondents thought that that is not how differentiated integration should be used, and that you could not have any form of DI in areas pertaining to Article 2.
Okay, that's very interesting, and it's also important to underline over and over again, both Stefan and yourself, Marta, mentioned the arbitrariness of the decision of basically involuntary opt-outs, kind of pisses the countries off. No, both the governments and the political parties are reacting rather negatively on that. I would like to follow up with a question that I also asked Stefan. Did you observe in your research any clear geographical cleavages when it comes to parties' positions on differentiated integration? What can you tell us about different member states' political parties when it comes to the DI? Thank you.
Yeah, so we did actually notice a geographical cleavage in views of DI. So in particular, what we noticed was that respondents from wealthier and usually older member states tended to be more favorable to DI than respondents from poorer and usually newer member states. And the reasons for this seem to be that respondents from richer member states usually saw differentiated integration as something that allowed opt-outs for those who were unwilling or unable to integrate, but also made it possible for those who wanted to go forward to do so. So in a way, it was one way to sort of continue with integration while sort of catering to the diversity, I suppose, of the European Union. Now, respondents from poorer and usually newer member states were much more skeptical about differentiated integration. So while they occasionally did acknowledge that they had benefited from certain exemptions, especially for the newer member states when they joined, they were also extremely concerned that DI would lead to them being excluded and relegated to a second-class status, because this had to some extent been their experience. So for example, one Greek respondent that we spoke to, I believe he used the quote that, being excluded wasn't really a choice for them. It is something that has sort of been exposed, that they had, that for poorer and less wealthy member state wasn't really a matter of choice. It was something that they were being kind of forced to do by others or asked kindly to do. So they were also really concerned that this would become a long-term exclusion from common projects. Another thing that we found, and I think this actually resonates also with what Stefan said, is that experience of DI also seemed to play a role in that respondents whose countries had not been exempted or excluded from certain policies were more likely to support DI than those whose countries had had a direct experience of DI. And this was both the case for richer and poorer member states. So for a country like Denmark, as we heard yesterday, for politicians felt that this had a cost for them. But also the involuntarily excluded felt quite strongly that this had harmed them in some way.
This is definitely very interesting. And since we are talking about political parties, I also want to ask you how the traditional left-right cleavage, and this would definitely connect well to Catherine afterwards, and pro-EU, anti-EU, pro-European integration, anti-European integration cleavage play out when it comes to political parties' positions on differentiated integration.
Yeah, so while we were doing this research, we really tried to think about, okay, how might we expect these factors to play into their responses? Should we expect to actually see political parties position on the left-right cleavage or on the pro or anti-EU axis determine their position on differentiated integration? And we actually found it extremely difficult to come up with any kind of expectations. Because, for example, we might be tempted to equate support for European integration with support for DI, but this would be quite a misleading move, because pro-integration parties, for example, may see DI as a threat to the unity of the European project and oppose it on those grounds. But they might also see it as a pragmatic way to overcome resistance to further integration. Conversely, Eurosceptics may view DI as an appealing option because it gives them a way to sort of opt out of unwanted integration and protect national sovereignty. But it can also be seen as a form of integration by stealth, because the idea is that this will eventually pressure their country into joining projects which they might have opposed. And there was something similar about the left-right cleavage. Now, we already know that the link between left and right and positions on pro versus anti-EU isn't particularly clear. And so we were trying to think, for example, of the case of left-wing parties. So if a left-wing party really cares about equality, how does this translate into their vision of DI? Would this mean that they would support DI as a way to sort of equalize starting conditions and foster economic convergence? Or should we expect them to be more likely to oppose it as potentially fostering discriminatory practices resulting in inequality? So we tried to think this through beforehand, and then when we went through the analysis, we basically found out that there were really no significant differences between the views of party actors of the left, right, and center. And we didn't really see many connections between being pro-EU or anti-EU and positions in differentiated integration. So this really seems to be something that is perhaps much more connected to where someone comes from as a country, rather than political party affiliations or general ideas on European integration. And I suppose there's one final caveat that we should add, is that one thing that we did find is also that sometimes political parties themselves were divided on the issue or didn't have a particularly clear stance. So this seems to resonate again with what Stefan's research found. So sometimes when we interviewed more than one respondent from the same party, it became evident that there was no established party line, so they told us themselves. And we had respondents from the same parties giving us different views concerning DI. So this does suggest that quite frequently, because there's no party line, there's really nothing that they can draw upon ideologically to answer these questions.
Okay, thank you also for the last remark. It's very interesting to hear that different actors inside the same political party also perceive the issue differently. I also assume while I was listening to you that sometimes maybe if you directly ask one policy area where there will be an opt-out, etc., they might have stronger positions, but maybe when you ask more theoretically on the possibility of a differentiated integration, etc., they have less knowledge and less certain opinions. At least that's what I thought. Thank you very much, Marta. And where you have left also connects very well to Catherine, because you couldn't find any strong differences between left, right, and pro-EU, anti-EU cleavages in the case of parties. But let's check what the citizens view when it comes to differentiated integration. Let's start with the first general question, Catherine. How do citizens view differentiated integration? Who is in favor and why?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ilke, for the introduction. Also great to see the others here. Stefan and I work together also on some papers, so it's really nice to see this roundup. And yeah, also I would have preferred to do this in Brussels, and hope that all of you and your families are well. So thinking a little bit about public opinion on DI. So for someone who's studied public opinion for quite a long time, and also particularly looked at Euroscepticism or other forms of opinion towards the EU, I think a first thing to say is that, of course, this is a very, very, very abstract discussion, very far removed from people's day-to-day lives. So the idea of, so for example, just give you an indication that in the polling that we did, so we relied, of course, on great polling that the Eurobarometer has done our own polling and done some survey experiments. That's basically the setup on public opinion that we did in this project to get a little bit more of a sense of it. We never used the word differentiated integration because no one has any idea what that means. So also things like multi-speeds, multiple ends, opt-outs, you have to explain a lot of this to voters, right? So, or to the public in general. So you often give a kind of a vignette explaining a certain situation and then try to capture that. So that's just a caveat, right? On the sense that it's not so easy to get people's opinions on this. And this probably also relates to what Stefan was saying before, that this has been more an instrumental tool that's used in order to think of accommodating certain member states when they think about the original opt-outs towards Denmark, when there's been a particular issue concerning a treaty, or having a discussion about, well, are there such asymmetries or structural imbalances within the EU that we might not be able, either on the fiscal side or whatever side, to reach an agreement, and therefore we should opt for things like enhanced cooperation or something like that. But those are, like very, very abstract discussions. If we then do think that we are able to really, Jim has a question. Sorry, I said it in the chat, and I will come back to that. If we really want to kind of get an idea of how that works over time, so the UN Barometer, there's been questions about this. Ultimately, it's often about, should member states be allowed to integrate at different speeds? That's a type of question. So a multiple speed idea, or the idea that a member state could, agree to a certain step of integration while another one stays behind, right? So, and might get an exception. So what you see basically is that at least across time, when it comes to multi-speed, especially, that the number of don't know, so people are able to say, I don't know what I think about this question, has substantially reduced. And interestingly also, it has reduced, especially since there's been, the work that Stefan and his team has done around issues when differentiated integration also became more of an issue or gained more salience in government discussion. So there is some idea that there might be a little bit of a top-down discussion, that people might not know so much about it and are looking to the political parties. So in some ways, it's we find slightly different things than Marta, in the sense that I think it is very structured at the voter end by who you support, what that party is saying on differentiated integration or on European integration more generally, and quite structured by both pro or anti-EU, as well as kind of more left-right, if we think that that's the, two dimensions of a dimension that's more about state intervention in the economy, or in the EU terms, more coordination by the EU, policy coordination of the EU versus more market, or a second dimension, which is, do we do more together or less together, i.e. more sovereigntist versus more pro-EU. So we do see these this kind of structure in people's opinions, and what you then see is actually quite interesting, and it might actually link up with the idea that some people have said early in the panel, that it might be structured by your nationality. But I wonder if your nationality also is kind of capturing the extent to which a country is more pro or anti-EU. Let's take a Dutch example, pragmatic pro-Europeans, right? That as long as it is an self-interested element that comes up. So you see that also in the way that the public views that. So multiple speeds is actually, I think, something that on average you see very much supported by quite pro-EU citizens, that I think about it in the way that also our data on how the Spanish government sees multi-speed European integration as a way to, well, if we can't do anything else, then maybe that's what we should do in order to kind of safeguard the EU, versus a more Eurosceptic stance. Of course, this is all on average, right? That is more Eurosceptic citizens that are more supportive of opt-outs. And I think if you wanted to think about this ideologically, I think it makes sense, or philosophically, I think it makes sense, in the sense that people do understand that maybe this idea of full-on integration and the train that moves forward is difficult to achieve with heterogeneity of member states. That's also what we see if we have open questions, that voters are aware of that. So then the pro-EU citizens think, well, then we go on some form of multiple speeds to keep the integration of parts and to keep the EU moving forward. Whereas I think Eurosceptics think, well, opt-outs are the first step towards a more sovereigntist kind of idea of the EU. And this is particularly pronounced also among the left and the right. And I think that's where you see that more pro-EU citizens that are left are much more pro multiple speeds, I think, as a way to keep that integration together, where right-wing Eurosceptic citizens are much more pro opt-outs. And that is also not entirely surprising if you think that the market should arrange a form of European integration. It should be like a survival of the fittest within that, or you want more policy coordination at the European level. And I think oftentimes we forget that this combination of perhaps being more quote-unquote sovereigntist might also be interlinked with people thinking that actually we should see less policy coordination in the economy, i.e. we shouldn't see any industrial policy, or we shouldn't see, which is oftentimes a more left-wing position. So I think, just to kind of summarize, you do see that ideology shapes differentiated integration opinions. People know more about it than they did in the past. So, and that I think comes with a slight increase in salience of this particular discussion. You might need to call it slightly different to get their opinions on it, because it's not that they're thinking in terms of differentiated integration, but then they're looking very much towards political actors or let's say opinion makers to get their opinions on it. So that kind of explains, I think, why ideology is structuring that, because people are much more likely to think, okay, I'm left wing, or I'm cosmopolitan, or I'm more right wing, and perhaps I'm more sovereigntist, and therefore I think X, Y, and Z. And if the, from that you maybe could derive an expectation that if differentiated integration becomes more part and parcel of debate, that people might start to have some more independent discussions of that. But I think so far we see very much a top-down view of voters and citizens forming opinions about it, but very much in line with those kind of political parties that they trust or they might vote for.
Actually, what you have said is very interesting, because if you are a pro-European leftist and you are pro-multi-speed Europe, you are pro-differentiated integration. And if you're a right-wing and you are pro-opt-outs because you want to stay out of things that you don't like, you are still pro-differentiated integration. So for different reasons, for one way or the other, you are still supporting differentiated integration. Can you a bit dive more into the geographical cleavages when it comes to citizens' perceptions? We have already asked this to Stefan and Marta, and I'm sure it will match well their perceptions when we were talking about governments and parties.
Yeah, so I do think that you see, two things that also Marta and Stefan refer to. So one is that there are geographical differences. So thinking about countries that are less favorable of forms of differentiated integration when it comes to levels. So we're not talking about how it gets structured, but just how much of it, if on a scale from 1 to 100%, how much in favor are you? So that especially when it comes to, for example, multi-speed integration, you see much less support in the Netherlands and Sweden. That me studying Euroscepticism is not entirely surprising. It's just anything that comes out of the EU is just less popular there than, let's say, well, let's take Spain and Poland actually is one of the countries on the other side of that, right? But then opt-outs, that flips. So actually opt-out support is much more supported in like Sweden and the Netherlands, much less in Spain and Poland. I could take other examples of countries, but I'm just doing it because those are kind of your prototype, more wary EU citizens on average in a population and that. But I think it is very difficult to do a lot with location. I understand that that's how we think in terms of governments. But then what we show in our work is that actually, because left-right ideology and your pro or anti-EU stance changes the way you see DI, that aggregate DI opinion of a country doesn't say so much because there's a distribution underneath it. So you have within in country as well, you have people who like or dislike it. So one of the papers we kind of called, is it a blessing or a curse, differentiated integration? Ilke, you're definitely right in terms of that there's pro DI support, but of course it's a different form of DI, right? That is being proposed, so that's one. And secondly, that even if you wanted to use DI in this instrumental way to get over treaty, to get over gridlock, as Stefan was referring to it, or as a kind of a gridlock buster to try to get through negotiations, you might be able to appease a certain government at that moment in time. But if another government would get a majority in the country, it might look very differently because you see a lot of politicization within the country. So not specifically about the I, but you see a lot of politicization about how should we move forward in the EU within countries, right? And that has become part and parcel of, let's say more progressive forces that want more integration, that think that, cross-border problems like environment and immigration should be tackled at the quote unquote efficient and functional form of government, which would be more, let's say, green, left type of parties, versus those that are more wary of integration on the more sovereigntist right end, that think, no, we should actually be kind of a Staatenbund, and we should, reform the EU to our favor, and opt-outs would be one way to do that, right? So I think that the issue of dealing with, so I know it's been very strongly advocated as, differentiate, even including myself, my last chapter of my book on Euroscepticism, as a way to overcome geographical differences. I've become a bit more wary of that now, looking more deeper into publics, where you do see that actually there's a lot of variation within countries about how they think. So you might solve it, let's say, for the Eurosceptics, but then you get actually the more pro-EU citizens in a country being more upset by the results. So in that way, I think it's a much more tricky instrument for governments, and it also raises maybe the issues that we've talked about before, that if you have an opt-out in one end, or you give a form of differentiation in one end, it might actually in the long term create issues again. It creates some form of instability in the kind of current equilibrium that needs to be addressed, which is probably the traditional kind of more German government position, that it just opens up for a lot of issues in the long term. And I think that some of it you do see in in the public, with the caveat that, of course, people are not as informed about DI as government officials or politicians would be.
Actually, one of my conclusions from what you have said is that we should be quite careful if we are supporting differentiated integration in general, because in the long term, with a government change, then we can find the country asking for lots of opt-outs, thinking that the differentiated integration has been a promoted concept in general. So it's as you have said, it might not be the best tool to overcome your skepticism in the long run. You have already answered my questions also on the left-right cleavages. I can shortly ask you on your perception of how these preferences evolved over time when the integration went further. But very shortly, because I also want to get in Richard to see how he has been perceiving all these comments from the scholars as a politician. Catherine.
Yeah, exactly. I can do it very shortly. So as I said, I think the main element of over time development is that people have more crystallized opinions about DI than they had before, which probably, if we think about it, it being a more top-down process, that when politicians start talking about it more, it's more, it becomes more of an issue. On the other hand, what you also see is some of the concerns that were raised by others, and links to your final thing, that would be the final thing I'd say, is that, this issue of, is DI the kind of solution to that? I also see that across time, some member states, we've done some experiments, when you get them, they are very concerned about who decides about DI. So i.e. that there's an institutional structure, and the idea that, for example, it will be a small group of richer member states that decide where to go, that is perceived as very kind of quote unquote unfair. So I think the issue of where DI might come forward is that it should not be something where you get a two-class citizenship. Or two-class membership. That's where we see also where a lot of public across time, when we later on did our experiments, also a bit more wary about that. So people know more, but they're also then, when you know more, you maybe have also more expectations about how it should look like, especially about, who should be in charge, how should it be organized, on which policy areas should it be the case. So I think that's the last thing I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Richard, after these very scholarly interventions based on solid research, what is your reaction? Could you please a bit comment on the main findings of our colleagues here? Thank you. You need to unmute yourself, please.
I think those were a fascinating set of presentations. So thank you very much to Stefan, Marta, and Catherine for that. If I step back a bit and look at the overall EU system, we don't have a simple two-tier system. DI has never functioned as a two-tier system. We don't have a group of countries that have gone ahead of another group of countries in all fields. We have different groups of laggards, if you like, or whatever you want to call them. There are 8 countries not in the Euro at the moment. There are 5 not in Schengen. There are 2 who do not participate in all areas of justice and home affairs cooperation. 1 has an opt-out on defense. 2 are not in the patent court. What do you notice about that? It's always a minority of states, and it's a different grouping, a different permutation each time, even if Denmark appears quite frequently in it. Nonetheless, it's a different pattern of states that are not in the core policy area concerned. So rather than an avant-garde in Europe, we have a number of different arrière-garde. But the core EU business, everybody is in, not least the single market, which has enormous implications in many fields. And the bulk of EU legislative activity is in that area, because the single market is not just about freedom of movement of goods, services, and capital. It's about common legislation on competition policy, on product standards, on consumer protection, on environmental standards, on workers' rights. It's a common external tariff in trade negotiations with third countries and acting in the world as a single unit on trade and economic matters. It's the bulk of what the EU does in terms of taking normative decisions. That's perhaps why as well in the European Parliament, which acts as half of the EU's bicameral legislature in those areas, you don't have differentiated voting. Members of the European Parliament, whichever country they're elected in, vote on all those areas where you do have differentiated integration. Members from countries not in the Euro vote on Euro-related questions, Schengen-related questions, and so on. That's also, of course, because the Parliament represents citizens, not states. You vote in the country that you live in. So a Pole living in Germany votes, a German living in Poland votes where they reside. So it's perhaps awkward to try and say only those elected here can vote on that and vice versa. But that's my general big picture view of it. The core of the EU is all the member states together. There are some fields where there are laggards or arrière-gardes. Even then, many of them wish to join in due course, as was pointed out for Schengen. It's involuntary second-tier participation. But it's limited to certain fields only. In terms of attitudes to it, I think it does correlate very much to attitudes to integration as such. And in terms of policies and politics and political parties, in the core position in the European Parliament, for instance, shared by the EPP, the Socialists, the Liberal Renew Group, the Greens, is normally to say all countries should move forward together in all areas of EU policy. But in practice, here and there, accepting the need to differentiate. I'll come back to that. But there is a wide range of other views, and it's not simply pro or against differentiated integration. It's quite a bit more complex. There are those who want to destroy the EU, not just their country leave it, but against the whole EU system as such. They think it's bad, evil. Not very numerous, but recently UKIP, for instance, before Brexit, that was their policy objective, and they had some allies in other countries, mostly on the far right. There are those who want their country to leave the EU, but not destroy it. They say they wish the EU well, but they don't think their country should be part of it. And they would like to completely opt out of all methods of integration if they could, but would make do with differentiated integration where with opt-outs if they can't leave the European Union. That was perhaps true of large parts of the British, not all, but large parts of the British Conservative Party when Britain was in the European Union, but again with some of their allies in other European countries in the CER group who are still there. There are those who want to stay in the European Union, but would prefer to opt out of some existing areas if they could. I'm thinking in particular of the PIS party in Poland and government in Poland and Fidesz in Hungary. There are those who would like to stay in the European Union as it is, but perhaps not go any further and would opt out of any further developments in, for instance, the field of defense or security or perhaps certain other areas. And then there's the converse of that, the mirror image, which is those who want to go further would like everybody to come along. But if that's not happening because one or two or three countries are opposed to it, then they would prefer to go ahead without those two or three countries, either by agreement, an amicable settlement that the bulk go ahead, but there are further opt-outs. That's happened a number of times in EU history, or even without agreement. Let's not forget the fiscal compact, the United Kingdom blocked from being part of the EU treaties, the others turned around and said, right, we'll go ahead without you. We'll sign a separate treaty by ourselves. You can go right back historically when the Six created the coal and steel community. They were saying in the wider Council of Europe framework, which in those days was the new big thing in Europe, it was the first time anything like that had been done in Europe. It wasn't the sort of backwater it is now. That was the big new innovative thing. Those that wanted to go further couldn't within that framework, created a new framework, just 6 of them, without the others, and then many others joined in later. So the core of why you have different attitudes to differentiated integration usually comes back to your attitude to integration as such, and the political compromises or gymnastics sometimes that have been necessary to allow these different views to coexist, or sometimes to break with each other and create a rupture. So those are my views on this matter.
Actually, that's very interesting, and also in general answered my second question on different groups' perceptions in the European Parliament. Now, you already said, like, depending on where the group stands, if destroy the EU and leave, don't destroy the EU but still leave, stay but try to opt out in different policy areas, etc., etc. Depending on where they stand on European integration, their positions on differentiated integration also change. I was wondering if you could give us more sectorial examples and connecting these examples to the political groups. Like, what kind of political groups are looking for what kind of opt-outs? And while they're okay with advancing one area of integration, they are against to another one. So a bit more sectorial difference and issue-based differences when it comes to differentiated integration in political groups in the European Parliament, if you can.
Yeah, well, I think I perhaps jumped the gun earlier and answered already your second question to a degree. I should have paused and waited for you to ask that. So you do find that in terms of the political groups as a whole, as entities in the European Parliament, it's more on the right wing, the ID group, especially on the far right, and the CER, the Conservatives group, so Conservatives and Reformists, they call themselves, also on the right wing, where you find generally favorable attitudes to differentiated integration in general as a principle, and in particular on particular policies, with different degrees of virulence, shall I say, within those groups. In the other political groups, it's more within political groups that you find one or another national party that has on one or another issue a favorable position towards particular forms of differentiated integration. In all the mainstream political groups, for instance, you would find that there are some Nordic parties, for instance, who accept European integration as far as it's gone, but are very wary about going deeper in terms of defense cooperation and security cooperation, or indeed much deeper in some aspects of police and home affairs in some cases. In those mainstream political parties, I call them mainstream, the big four, shall we say, in the European Parliament, the Socialists, the EPP, the Liberals, Renew, as they call themselves now, and the Greens, you find pockets on particular policy areas of particular national parties that have that view, but sometimes equally divisions within those national parties on it. But what governs those views is attitudes to integration generally.
This is what you're saying is very interesting, because when we cannot just see this as political groups as a whole, but we should also take the views of national delegations inside of them, and this mainly combines it with Stefan's point, no? The governments in their own countries, or the opposition parties in their own countries, connects very much to national delegations. So there's also a back and forth between member states, their parties and parties, and political groups.
Yes.
Go ahead.
But beware of saying these are national attitudes, because you have dividing lines within countries between parties. The current Polish government, the PIS government's view on these things is different from the Polish opposition. The Hungarian government at the moment, the Fidesz government, and the views of the opposition parties on this, though they have different views internally as well, but are quite different. Just as if you look at in France, to take a long-standing founding member state of the European Union, the views on deeper integration between different French political parties is very different. So we cannot conclude that these are unified national positions, that in a certain country X, Y, or Z, everybody thinks we don't want this, or we don't want to join that aspect of European integration, the Euro or Schengen or whatever it is. There are political divisions within those countries. Conversely, in the political groups in the European Parliament, yeah, there are national nuances. Europe is a mosaic of political divisions and national divisions. It's not, you never have everybody in one country thinking one thing and everybody in another country thinking the opposite. And then the divisions are more political, but also within the European Parliament, the political groups, there are national nuances within them. So it's a matrix.
Very, very good points. And again, underlining the importance of national delegations in the political groups, but with an eye on if they're coming from the government, from the opposition, or what kind of political settlement in their member states. Very good point. A rather difficult question for you, Richard, because what we have been hearing is that the differentiated integration is complicated. Catherine already said that most of the citizens don't even understand it as a concept, but mostly see it as policy areas to be in and or out, or a way to advance European integration or not, etc., etc. So how do we reconcile the increased complexity of a differentiated EU with the need to better communicate the EU and its citizens in times of rising Euroscepticism? How do we overcome this challenge? What are the ideas for a veteran politician in that regard?
Yeah, you rightly point out that citizens don't know the term differentiated integration or other academic shorthands, but they do understand very clearly, my country isn't in the Euro, or my country isn't in Schengen, and I think it should be, or I think it shouldn't be. That's quite clearly understood and a matter of political debate in the countries concerned. And conversely, sometimes in the countries that are in these things about the others, it is a political issue in countries that are in Schengen about whether to allow Romania and Bulgaria into Schengen, for instance. Now, maybe it shouldn't be, but the fact is that there is political resistance to letting those countries join Schengen at the moment, at least. So these issues, if you're looking at the substance of them, is understood by the public. They won't understand terms like differentiated integration, multi-speed Europe. That's a bit more difficult to grasp, but the actual issues are well understood. And in terms of defending the EU as such, I would still go back to my opening comment. The bulk of EU business involves every member state on an equal basis. That remains the case for the overwhelming majority of EU legislation, where the EU adopts measures that are binding on member states and on citizens. That's single market and all the policies and issues related to it, including sectoral policies like the common agricultural policy and aspects of cross-border transport and so on, as well as the things I listed earlier. All that everybody's in it together. It's certain fields, important ones, yes, and tricky ones, but only certain fields where you have this differentiated integration. And sometimes, even in theory, to a degree, that's a temporary thing. All member states except Denmark are legally committed one day to joining the euro. The member states that are not in Schengen, other than Ireland, all want to one day join Schengen. So to a degree, perhaps this is not a permanent feature, or sorry, the aspects of it that are permanent are much more limited than the numbers currently suggest, would be a better way of putting it.
Definitely very interesting, and it's personally it's good to know that citizens mainly know the differences between these core issues, even if they don't understand the academic concepts we name them. Actually, Jim, can I ask Jim, Paolo, and Raquel to voice their questions, because Jim just wrote one question for Richard in the chat, but maybe it would be more in person, like if you could voice it, if that is possible technically. If otherwise, I'm happy to read the questions written in the chat. Jim, is it possible that you connect to the conversation? Let's see.
Does it work now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I'm sorry because I'm on my iPhone, so I have some troubles. I'll be very brief because I have written my questions. I first wrote a question to Marta and Catherine saying, would you agree that party affiliation is less important as far as DI is concerned than nationality? But Richard has now introduced an interesting idea. It's true for mainstream parties, but not for Eurosceptic parties. Secondly, I made a comment on Stefan's very interesting exposition. It is true that governments look at this as a practical tool, and all the attempts at constructing a core Europe, like Schäuble-Lammers in the 90s, have failed. And even the French have not managed to transform the euro area into a core. And that is why he's absolutely right. That does not mean that differentiated integration is not important. It is very important. But it is a practical tool. And my last remark is, the point was made yesterday, someone said about the fear of being left out. That was what dominated the drafting of the text at the Amsterdam Treaty when DI was integrated into the treaty. It was very much dominated by the fear of misuse of differentiated integration and of excluding countries. So that's basically what I want to say. Thank you, but a very interesting debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. I will also try to get the other questions so we can group them. Can I ask Paolo and then Raquel to voice their questions as well? Is this possible? Paolo, at least I can't hear you.
Hi.
Hi, perfect.
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask you, Catherine, do you feel that there is a overall mismatch in the overall understanding of differentiated integration between academics and citizens? So from what I understand from the data and your very interesting papers, citizens mainly tend to see differentiated integration as a kind of Eurosceptic alternative to uniform further integration, whereas in my experience, academics tend to focus on differentiated integration as a Europhile alternative to no further integration. So people here opt out and they think, but they want to opt out from existing rules, whereas this is not possible, of course, in areas where unanimity rules, the opt-out is a means to allow other countries to move forward.
Thank you very much. Raquel, can we hear from you as well?
Yes, I think you can hear me now.
Yes, perfect.
So thank you very much for your presentation. I'm an academic assistant at the College of Europe, and I've studied the EPPO for an MA thesis, so this is where my question comes from. But I was wondering, what do opposition parties use the I for if they ever talk about it? Do they use it for arguing for opt-outs if they gain power, or would they argue for reintegration if they ever become part of the governing coalition, or maybe they don't use it for campaigns at all? But the case of the EPPO and the Netherlands seems to be an indication of perhaps a change in the governing coalition meant the overturning the decision to not participate in the EPPO. So I wonder if there's anything to this, or it's just an exception.
Thank you very much. I will also put two more questions on the table and then give in the participants the reverse order answer chance. The first one was actually where Stefan left on what other factors explain the positions of the member states, and also a short question to Marta. Marta, could you please a bit elaborate more on this concept and the impact on democracy? So, like, what are the positions of political parties or the discourses when it comes to establishing the relationship between democracy and differentiated integration? Okay, Richard, let's start with you, if it's okay, in the reverse order, and you have already directed questions directly to you. The floor is yours.
Yes, I wasn't quite sure which ones were directed at me, but rather than somebody else. But let me pick up on Jim's point about the fear of being left out. At key moments in the development of the EU, where new policies, new fields were being added on, which not all member states were keen on, there was that creative tension. Let's think about the creation of the euro. There were 2-3 countries that clearly didn't want to, at that point anyway, join in a single currency. It would have been possible for the others to say, you can't, well, I think that did happen to a degree, you cannot stop us. If necessary, we would make a separate treaty among ourselves, though we would prefer to do it in the EU framework. And the countries that were opposed to it accepted that it be done in the EU framework because they didn't want to allow another completely different framework where they had no involvement in whatsoever being set up. There was that creative tension, and the result was opt-outs for 2 countries at the time from joining the euro. Schengen came about in a different way. That was an avant-garde that pioneered it, Benelux, France, and Germany, and gradually more countries joined in, and then it was brought into the treaty, accepted that it be part of the treaty by all, but 3 countries, sorry, well, they're different permutation countries, the UK and Ireland, mainly because they're islands, by the way. It wasn't necessarily an ideological opposition, although many people have analysed it that way, I think wrongly. Decided that they wouldn't like to join it, but they allowed it to be brought into the EU. So it came about in a completely different way. But each time it's been this creative tension with those that are not keen on it, nonetheless accepting that it be done in the EU framework, rather than risk some new system being set up without them, which they had no involvement in whatsoever.
Very, very interesting and historical comment, actually, and thank you very much for putting that on the table. Catherine.
Sure. No, I think I already said a little bit to Jim's questions about that. I think party affiliation, at least, and also party ideology plays an important role for citizens, partly because to make up for their information and shortfalls and look at what the experts, quote unquote, say about differentiated integration. that said, I think it might differ, was one of the last points, it might differ about when it comes to party identifiers. So what a lot of work, also some of the past work has shown that there's much more consistent voting based on the EU, or the part of the appeal of voting for, let's say, very pro-EU parties, or new left, centrist, cosmopolitan parties, or more anti-EU parties. That's much more shaped on EU consideration, where voting for a lot of mainstream parties is not. And you see a lot of differentiations in European parliamentary elections, where voters who nationally would vote for their mainstream party are now voting for a much more Eurosceptic or much more pro-EU stance. Because the main appeal of mainstream parties is not their EU position. The main appeal of a mainstream party is what they do nationally, and often is kind of left-right general elements and kind of vague positions on the EU, to be very fair, which also, gives them possibilities to, adds to creative ambiguity that they can use at the European level. So in that way, it might differ across parties. I would agree with that. Then on the question, I think it was Paula's question about the extent to which there's a difference in understanding between DI, between citizens and academics. I have the feeling, if you ask, and that's also in kind of the open questions, if you ask a citizen about the DI, they think opt-outs. That's what they think about. And many citizens do not know that you couldn't opt out of something existing, right? So let's say there's a small minority in the Netherlands that doesn't like the euro and still thinks that the Netherlands can go out of the euro without any consequence. That that would be a thing that it could do. So in that way, I do think that there is a lot of differences between kind of the legal provisions. To be fair, I was part of a committee for the Dutch Finance Ministry about thinking about the EU's European future. And then when I was talking to some of the people actually Dutch parliamentarians, they were not entirely clear about what legally could be done, right? So I think that people might be experts on their own national constitutions, but less so within the EU. That might be a Dutch example. I'm not sure that that's the case in every country. You would have to talk to the specialists of the parties. And that's maybe also an opinion sharing. So I do think that this opt-outs thing is very clear. It also comes from the fact that those have been the most salient things within the news. Like those have been the discussion that have been discussed. Also, when Brexit is discussed, it's often, oh, why is Britain doing this? Because it already got opt-outs in X, Y, and Z, right? So it already had a very differentiated relationship with the EU. So in that way, I think people often understand it within opt-outs. I do think that what I highlighted is that it differs based on your pro or anti-EU position. And part of that might also reflect why academics see it a certain way. I mean, I've not met many academics who don't think that problems are transnational and require some form of international policy coordination. May they be European or not. So, it might be not that everybody is a pro-EU person on the basis and thinks it's all amazing what the EU does. No, we're equally critical about our national systems than we are about the EU. But I think the idea that one should not have forms of policy coordination to deal with, key challenges when it comes to economic stability, the environment, migration, etc., is very prevailed within academics. So I think that's probably can explain how they see differentiated integration as a way to safeguard the possibility for a set of European countries to still tackle these issues together with some wider range of external differentiated member states / former member states, not member states around it, right? So I think that might be explaining it, but I think the key indication that you have is indeed that what is the most salient in people's heads is opt-outs, but that's not, that's only one particular form of differentiated integration. So the idea of, when you ask people about enhanced cooperation, they have no idea what that means. Also, just not that many journalists that I talk to are fully aware of, it had to be when Macron was saying it in Next Generation EU. I don't know if you remember in this last evening before, there was this idea that maybe enhanced cooperation would come about. Then I remember getting some calls from journalists. Okay, what's that exactly? Could you explain? So I think it's also the element is that these issues become more pronounced when they have been introduced. So because opt-outs have been a part of and partial of European integration, they are more, they've been more, words used, and therefore people see it more. So I'm not sure it's a preference. I think it's more of a salience issue of